A philosopher of comparative religions has spoken of the terror of history, by which he means that all the achievements and the aspirations of human beings are wiped out mercilessly, relentlessly, and forgotten in the ongoing changes of history. So we can feel the terror of history in the loss of the Greek civilization and its youthful zest for democracy, philosophy, the arts, mathematics, science, and the good life. After the defeat of Athens in the Peloponnesian War, the Greek city-states were conquered by the armies of Alexander the Great and were absorbed finally in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire built upon its inheritance from the Greeks. But then we see the decline and fall of the Roman Empire too. The Roman Empire had conquered all of Europe and the Middle East and much of Africa. But in time it had become stagnant and paralyzed by the unmanageability of this immense far-flung imperial territory, and was increasingly plagued also by barbarian invasions. The city of Rome itself was invaded and plundered, this magnificent city, by the Visigoths in 410 AD. By the 5th century, with the weakening of the empire, Christianity, on the other hand, had already become the official religion of the empire, and the church structure was now the only powerful organization in all of Europe. By this time also, Christian beliefs and values and attitudes dominated the Roman Empire, and while some of the heritage of the classical Greek and Roman civilization was retained and used by the church, many Greek and Roman writings were destroyed because the church considered them to be pagan, unchristian, and immoral. And so for over 1,000 years, from the 5th to the 15th century, Christianity shaped the entire social and cultural world of Europe. It shaped its political and personal life, social institutions, economic relations, knowledge of the natural world, literature, and the arts. All of these were under church direction and control. Philosophy, science, and art were all seen to be placed rightfully in the service of religion. And the free, rational, independent philosophical speculation of the Greeks was brought to an end by Christianity and was not to be restored until the Renaissance and the modern era in which Descartes is the first philosopher. The classical worldview of Plato and his great pupil Aristotle was of a natural cosmos, rational, ordered, moral, and purposeful, the cosmos which was known solely by human reason. This was replaced by the supernaturalistic worldview of the church, whose source of its knowledge is divine revelation, and whose fundamental beliefs, such as the Incarnation and the Trinity, are dogmas to be accepted by faith. These dogmas are not proven, nor are they provable by reason. For the early Catholic worldview, the fundamental problem is that of the relation of the individual soul to a just and merciful and omnipotent Father God, a God so loving that he sacrificed his only Son that the rest of humanity might be redeemed. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. The world itself and human beings are the creation of God and fulfill his purposes. The crucial issue is personal salvation for the sinful, erring self in a corrupt and unjust society. The way to salvation is by purity of heart, repentance of sins, by love of God and love of one's neighbor as oneself. The good life for human beings is not the life of reason, not science, philosophy, mathematics, and the arts are important, but rather the good life for human beings is a life of faith, devotion, prayer, good works, love, and obedience to God and to his church. But in the terror of history, in which civilizations such as the great Greek civilization disappear, the great philosophies seem to survive through a kind of immortality. Plato and his great pupil Aristotle survived. Ironically, the two greatest philosophers of Christianity, the great saints Augustine and Thomas, they produced their profound philosophies by fusing Christianity with precisely the pagan Greek philosophy which the church had almost entirely destroyed. St. Augustine fused Christianity with Plato, St. Thomas with Aristotle. St. Augustine is now known as the Platonizer of Christianity, as the synthesizer of Christianity with the philosophy of Plato. But by the second half of the 4th century, when Augustine was growing up in the Roman province of Numidia, which is now part of Algeria, in North Africa, intellectual darkness was rapidly descending. The Roman Empire was disintegrating. Its vast cultural resources suffered from the empire's neglect and from the church's indifference or hostility to pagan culture. It is uncertain today how much, if any, of the writings of Plato himself or of Plato's followers was available for Augustine to study. So thoroughly had the books of pagan philosophers been lost or destroyed. Yet in some form, the influence of Plato did reach Augustine. Augustine's greatest work was called The City of God, which he wrote to try to explain the sack and fall of Rome in 410. In this work, the voice of Plato can be heard. The Platonic distinction between the sensible and the intelligible world is expressed by Augustine in Christian terms as the distinction between the earthly city of the flux of opinion and the heavenly city of God's eternal truth. As for Aristotle, the most important works of Aristotle, the second greatest philosopher of the ancient world, some people would say the first, had been lost or destroyed by the church. But it had survived the writings of Aristotle in the Middle East, in the Eastern Christian church. And with the rise of Mohammedanism, the works of Aristotle were translated by Arabs into Arabic, and then they were translated by Jews into Hebrew and into Latin. And so the works of Aristotle were finally made available again to the Western world by the 12th century. St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century was accordingly able to build upon the recovery of the detailed philosophic writings of Aristotle. St. Thomas brought scholasticism to its highest stage of development. During the Middle Ages, the philosophers who undertook to make a philosophical system out of Christian beliefs and to prove them were called schoolmen, and their philosophic systems were called scholastic philosophy or scholasticism. Scholasticism may be defined as the philosophy of the medieval cathedral schools, which attempted to fuse Christian beliefs with the Greek philosophy of Plato or Aristotle, using the logical syllogism and debate. The great synthesizing philosophy of St. Thomas is, in fact, the greatest system of Catholic philosophy ever written. It is called the Summa Theologia. It is not only the greatest system of Catholic philosophy ever written, but one of the greatest systems of philosophy ever written. It became the standard philosophy of the Middle Ages, and its influence continues into the present time. It is known as Thomism. Thomism is a worldview claiming absolute truth. It is based upon faith in divine revelation and upon supporting reason. St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa provided theology, metaphysics, theory of knowledge, ethics, psychology, and politics. But historical changes were already at work. St. Thomas's interpretation of Aristotle, which was so important an element in his formulation of Christian thought, his interpretation was soon challenged by other scholars. Why was that? Because now Aristotle's writings were available for all to read. More and more, free discussion was demanded for all important problems. And the absolute sovereignty of the two great medieval institutions, the Roman Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire, were both beginning to be weakened. By the 15th century, scholars and writers were turning to the classical Greek civilization for new inspiration. And with the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453, the entire world of vast learning of Greek culture, which had been preserved in the Eastern Empire, was made available to the Christian West. The courts of kings, the popes, the universities, everyone was excited by the new art and literature that they had rediscovered. Access to these classical treasures resulted in the European period called the Renaissance. Literally, Renaissance means rebirth, and it was truly a rebirth of classical learning and a rebirth of European civilization. But also what was made available was an opposition to the prevailing Christian religiosity of the Middle Ages. This opposition took the form of the revival of Greek humanism. Humanism may be defined as the affirmation of the dignity and worth of human beings in respect of the power of human reason and the human capacity for seeking, knowing, and achieving what is good. The invigorating secular focus of Greek humanism was rediscovered. That Greek humanism which was man and nature-centered and which affirmed the power of human reason to know the truth of nature and to determine the good for human beings. In the Renaissance, human achievements and talents are no longer regarded as worthless, but are celebrated and honored. Human beings are glorified, and art turns in the direction of expressing not suffering and death, but the Greek joy in living. Nature became interesting in itself and was not merely symbolic of the supernatural. A visual revolution began to take place among artists who increasingly turned away from painting and sculpting Christian subject and Christian symbolism to painting and sculpting things as they appear to the eye of the artist in nature. Artists discovered the human body again and began to study the physiology, the muscles and bones of the human body in motion. Michelangelo's Adam and Leonardo's Last Supper are examples, magnificent examples, of the highly developed Renaissance portraiture of the natural human body in action. The good life is again the life of reason, discovering and satisfying the needs of the whole person harmoniously and with balance. The 15th century was not only the beginning of the Renaissance revival of classical learning and of a humanistic fidelity to nature, to the human body, and to human reason in painting, sculpture, and literature, but also by the 15th century there were many other developments, each of which struck a blow at the weakening structure of the medieval world. The 15th century was the time of the great discoveries, so-called. The discovery of the New World by Columbus and his successors, and the other great discovery, the discovery of the all-water route to India and the Far East, around the Cape of Good Hope. With the discoveries of these new trade routes came a great burst of energy and optimism, and the development of shipping technology, related scientific knowledge, a money economy, banking and insurance, and the emergence of a new social class, the bourgeoisie, which was to become the capitalist class, and with all of this, the decline of the older feudal aristocracy. The Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, which was begun by Martin Luther, struck another blow at the unity of the medieval Christian world. But most significantly, what developed during the Renaissance and during the period of the discoveries and their aftermath is a revolutionary new view of truth. In opposition to the scholastic view, the truth relates to a divine, supernatural, or transcendent reality, which is forever inaccessible to human reason and known only by revelation. The shift is to the new view that human reason has the power to know the truth of reality, and that reality is neither divine nor transcendent. Especially did this new view hold for astronomy, which was reborn in the 15th century. By the time of the 16th century, all the best minds were attracted to astronomy. As today, so many minds are attracted to the frontiers of space exploration. New and careful astronomical observations were made, and discrepancies were found between these new observations and what was claimed by the prevailing astronomical theory, which was the Ptolemaic theory, invented by Ptolemy in the 2nd century, the Earth-centered theory, the theory that the Earth is the center of the universe. The Ptolemaic theory prevailed from the 2nd century to the 16th century for 14 centuries. Nicholas Copernicus, the Polish astronomer in the 16th century, using new observations and mathematics, using the methods of empiricism and rationalism, overthrew the Earth-centered Ptolemaic theory and offered the new sun-centered heliocentric theory that the Earth revolves on its own axis and moves around the sun. This theory accounted for the new observations and also greatly simplified the mathematical calculations of the older, now antiquated Ptolemaic theory. Ever since Copernicus overthrew, in this revolutionary way, Ptolemaic theory, any drastic change in thought has been called a Copernican revolution. For us, it is difficult to imagine a similar challenge to our accustomed beliefs, such as the challenge of the Copernican Revolution to the traditional belief that the Earth is the center of the universe. Such a tremendous jolt to the imagination, such a reversal of what is taken to be immutable truth it was. It would be comparable for us to suddenly have the announcement of the discovery of superior conscious intelligence in outer space. Science fiction, Star Trek, even some scientists have opened up this possibility for us. But the response of the Copernican Revolution, the response to the Copernican Revolution by the great Church of Rome was extreme. Scientists were excommunicated or banned from the church and condemned to everlasting hell if they refused to deny these new ideas. And they were subject to imprisonment, torture, or even death for broaching these new ideas. This was accomplished either through the office of the Pope or with the help of the reigning kings or princes of Europe. Copernicus himself hesitated to publish his theory for fear of the church's reaction, but his publication went unnoticed, and it was only his followers in the next century who were caught up with. In 1600, at the turn of the 17th century, Bruno was burned at the stake in Rome as an atheist for accepting Copernican theory. In 1620, Vanini, who called himself a naturalist, was burned at the stake in Toulouse in France as an atheist. And in 1621, Fontanier was burned in Paris as an atheist. But among the scientists, the new astronomers, it was Galileo who came under attack because he undertook to prove the Copernican theory in the 17th century. Galileo developed a telescope magnifying 1,000 times by which he observed the satellites of Jupiter, Saturn's rings, and the moon's surface. Unlike Copernicus, Galileo vigorously and actively tried to publicize the new heliocentric or sun-centered theory, and as a result he met with formidable church opposition, and he was censored for his views. But in 1632, he wrote another great work called Two Systems of the World, in which he in effect repeated the Copernican theory, although he was allegedly only comparing the Copernican and the older Ptolemaic theory as two systems. For this, he was condemned, forced to deny the doctrine of Copernicus upon his knees, forced to recite the 7 penitential psalms weekly for 3 years, and was imprisoned thus until his death. Meanwhile, the scientific spirit moved on. Technology, new inventions, new observations, and new scientific theories were spreading all over Europe. The telescope, the microscope, and the thermometer were invented. Boyle developed his theory of gases. New laws of electricity and magnetism were developed. Laws of optics by Descartes and Snell. Harvey developed the theory of the circulation of the blood, and Descartes invented analytical geometry. But what is the nature of the new science and its method? 2 elements in scientific method were identified. 1, the empirical element, the use of sensory observation and experimentation. And 2, the rational element, the use of mathematics and deductive reasoning, as by Copernicus and Galileo, in explaining the motion of the heavenly bodies. Almost immediately, conflicting theories of scientific method appeared, depending upon which of the 2 elements, the empirical or the rational, was claimed to be the more important. Francis Bacon in England looked at scientific method and claimed it for empiricism. He claimed that scientific method was a triumph of the method of observation and experimentation, a triumph of these over reason, theories, hypotheses, systems. But Rene Descartes, the philosopher, however, looked at scientific method and claimed it for rationalism. The scientific method, as far as Descartes was concerned, was a triumph of the new mathematics, of geometry, of axioms and deduction from axioms. These, according to Descartes, make science into the certainty of knowledge which it possesses. The new age of the 17th century, in which all beliefs were changing, and in which the new scientific method and scientific discoveries were advancing so rapidly, this was an age in which the medieval philosophy of scholasticism was clearly no longer adequate. A new philosophy is required for this new age, and Rene Descartes is the first philosopher of the modern age, and Rene Descartes offers the first metaphysical theory in response to the new scientific view of the universe and in relationship to the counterclaims of the church. Descartes is born in 1596 at the turn of the 17th century, 4 years before Bruno was burned at the stake as a Copernican. Descartes was the son of a lawyer in Brittany, in the northern part of France. His family was one of the oldest and most respected in the region. Descartes was brought up with all of the amenities of noble and upper-class life. In his early years, he wore the green velvet dress and the sword of French nobility. He attended La Flèche, a famous Jesuit college, from 10 to 18 years of age. And he was dissatisfied, however, with his education there and unconvinced of any truth that he could be sure of. He was weary of textbooks based on confused ideas and unconfirmed science, and weary of the authoritative dogmas of the church. When he completed his studies at La Flèche, he stopped reading entirely and began to travel. Here we have a very modern note, like the despair of someone in our time who longs for moral certainty and finding none might stop reading entirely, and who also might just go off to the Himalayas and look for a guru. The longing for certainty was always paramount with Descartes. Mathematics alone he regarded as certain. But what relation did mathematics have to other kinds of knowledge? And so he begins his travels. In 1618, he joined the army of Prince Maurice of Nassau as an unpaid volunteer. Doing this kind of thing represented a kind of war college for young members of the nobility. Descartes followed the advancing army at his own leisure while studying music and mathematics. In 1619, Descartes transferred to another army, to the army of the Duke of Bavaria, and he was detained by the weather in November in the year 1619 in the small German town of Ulm, where he remained for a whole day, shut up in his hot room in the company of a huge Bavarian stove. He had decided to review his situation, philosophical and personal. That night, he had a vision in a dream, and in his diary there is the following momentous entry. 10th of November, 1619. I was filled with enthusiasm. I discovered the foundations of a marvelous science, and at the same time, my vocation was revealed to me. He takes a vow that he will devote the rest of his life to establish this new science, and he promises to visit the shrine of Our Lady of Loretto to give thanks for the vision he was given. What was this vision? It was a vision of a plan for a single unified science in which philosophy and all the sciences would be integrated, interconnected in one systematic totality. And all qualitative differences of things would be treated mathematically as quantitative differences, and mathematics would be the key to all the problems of the universe. By contrast with Plato, who saw the unity of all sciences in the idea of the good, for Descartes, the unity of science was a rationalistic and mathematical unity based on clear and distinct mathematical ideas as axioms. For the next 9 years, Descartes devoted himself to working out a method for this unification of the sciences. Meanwhile, he sold the estates in France, which he had inherited from his wealthy father, so as to have the funds to live, as he says, free from the obligation of making a living from my science. Leisure enabled him to sleep a lot, which he liked a lot. He usually stayed in bed until noon, and has come to be known as the philosopher who did his best work in bed. He recommends idleness to anyone who would wish to produce good intellectual work, and he values his leisure as being without cares or passions to trouble me. He remains always aloof from the moral and political conflicts of his day. Like other philosophers of his time, he did not become a professor at a university, since the universities were then so censored by the church that they had become stagnant and extremely hostile to the new science and toward anyone like Descartes who would profess the new science. Descartes was always a solitary man, and he decides that no social commitments and no marriage bonds will he ever make, so as not to interfere with his vow to advance knowledge by the vision of the new method. He refused to be married, saying, "No beauty is comparable to the beauty of truth." But Descartes also expressed a startlingly cynical view of marriage, saying, when a husband weeps over a dead wife, in spite of this, in his innermost soul, he feels a secret joy. And yet, Descartes did have an illegitimate daughter, whose death in her early childhood appears to have saddened him greatly, and he was a long time recovering from that. Descartes settled in Holland when he was 32 years old, and he lived there for 20 years, enjoying the toleration of the Dutch government. In 1622, he finished his Copernican treatise on the world. But as he was about to send the treatise off for publication, he learned that Galileo had been condemned by the Inquisition of the Catholic Church, and that Galileo's book had been publicly burned. Descartes immediately hurried to stop publication of his own book, and he says, it is imprudence to lose one's life when one can save oneself without dishonor. And he has the word spread about that he holds theology in the highest esteem as well as the church. Descartes' scholars are divided on Descartes' real views about the church and his teachings. Descartes also says, now that I am to be not only a spectator of the world, but am to appear an actor on its stage, I wear a mask. Descartes' mask represents one way of dealing with the fear of persecution. But one thinks also of Socrates, or of the contemporary Russian dissenter Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who did not wear masks and who were outspoken in the face of persecution and willing to face death or deportation. 3 years after this, Descartes published his Discourse on Method, a discourse on scientific method which remains a philosophic classic to this very day. And 10 years later, he published the Meditations on First Philosophy, which we are reading here. The last important event in Descartes' life was his receiving a request he could not refuse, from the Queen Christina of Sweden, the intellectual queen, to come and help her understand his philosophy, which he was trying to read. Returning from court one November morning in 1650, he got a chill and died of pneumonia within a week. Thus perished the greatest philosopher of France at the height of his powers. What is the claim of Descartes to greatness as a philosopher? Étienne Gilson, himself a 20th century famous French philosopher, says of Descartes, he lived by thought alone, for thought alone. Never was an existence more noble than his. Next time, we'll take a look at some of his thoughts.
Pre-recorded in the studios of the Maryland Center for Public Broadcasting.